The morning started like any other at the Maplewood post office. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights filled the room, accompanied by the shuffle of papers and the occasional ring of the service bell. Behind the counter, Leah Carter moved with practiced efficiency, scanning packages, assisting customers, and answering questions with her characteristic warmth. Her role as a postal clerk wasn't glamorous, but she took pride in her work. It was steady, honest, and served the community she loved. But that day, the usual rhythm was shattered. "Excuse me, I need to speak with someone in charge, right now." A man's voice boomed through the lobby, sharp and accusatory. He stormed up to the counter, his face red and his hands clutching a crumpled receipt. Leah glanced up, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" "You can help by telling me where my package is," he snapped. "It was supposed to be delivered yesterday. It's worth thousands of dollars and now it's gone." Leah's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that. Let me look into it for you. Can I see the receipt?" The man shoved it across the counter. As Leah typed the tracking number into the system, she felt the weight of his glare. The computer screen loaded slowly, revealing the dreaded words: status, undeliverable, package missing. Leah's stomach sank. "It looks like the package was marked as undeliverable," she said carefully. "But I'll investigate this for you." "You'd better," the man growled. "I was told you were the one who handled it." The accusation hit her like a slap. Leah straightened, meeting his gaze. "I assure you, sir, I process hundreds of packages a day, and I treat them all with care." "Well, something happened," he said, his voice rising. "And I'm holding you responsible." The accusation spread through the post office like wildfire. By lunch, Leah could feel the change in her co-workers' demeanour. They avoided eye contact, whispered in corners, and some even gave her wary glances. The weight of their judgment settled heavily on her shoulders. She tried to focus on her work, but the knot in her chest tightened with each passing hour. It wasn't just the potential loss of her job that worried her. It was the sting of being doubted, the feeling of being isolated in a place where she had once felt respected. That evening, as Leah locked up the office, her supervisor, Mr. Hargrove, called her into his office. His expression was serious, and Leah braced herself. "Leah, we've received a formal complaint about the missing package," he said. "Until we figure out what happened, I have to place you under review." Her heart sank. "Mr. Hargrove, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't even remember handling that package specifically." "I believe you," he said gently, "but you know how these things go. The customer is demanding answers, and we need to provide them." Leah nodded, her throat tight. "I understand." As she left the office, Leah resolved to prove her innocence. She couldn't just wait for the investigation to run its course, not when her reputation and livelihood were on the line. That night, Leah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by receipts, notes, and printouts of tracking information. She combed through every detail of the package's journey, searching for anything that might explain its disappearance. The tracking data showed that the package had been scanned at the Maplewood facility, but never loaded onto the delivery truck. Somewhere between the counter and the truck, it had vanished. Leah frowned. If the package hadn't left the facility, then the answer had to be inside the post office. But where? The next morning, Leah arrived early, determined to retrace her steps. She checked the shelves, the storage room, and even the outgoing bins. Nothing. Frustration bubbled within her, but she refused to give up. As she searched, she noticed something odd. A corner of torn paper peeking out from beneath a shelf near the loading dock. Leah crouched down, reaching for it. Her fingers brushed against something solid, and she pulled out a small box, dusty and slightly crumpled. Her breath caught. It was the missing package, but her relief was short-lived. The shipping label had been partially torn off, and there was no way to prove who had mishandled it. Leah examined the shelf, noticing scuff marks on the floor as if the box had been kicked underneath. It was clear that someone had tried to hide it. Her pulse quickened. Someone in the post office had deliberately sabotaged her. Leah stared at the package in her hands, her mind racing. Someone had tried to sabotage her, and this box was the proof. But how could she prove who had done it? She needed more than a hunch. She needed evidence. Returning the package to its rightful place on the loading dock, Leah discreetly marked the shelf where she found it, using a piece of tape to remember the exact spot. She then headed to Mr. Hargrove's office. "Sir," she said, placing the package on his desk, "I found the missing shipment." His eyebrows shot up. "Where was it?" "It was kicked under a shelf near the loading dock," Leah explained, "but the label was damaged, and I don't think it got there by accident." Mr. Hargrove's expression darkened. "Are you saying someone intentionally hid it?" "It's the only explanation that makes sense," Leah said. "Packages don't just end up under shelves." Mr. Hargrove leaned back, his fingers steepled. "This is serious, Leah. Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" "I don't," Leah admitted, "but I want to find out." After a moment, Mr. Hargrove nodded. "Let me review the security footage from the loading dock. If anyone mishandled this package, it should show up there." The following day, Mr. Hargrove called Leah into his office. His expression was grim as he gestured for her to sit. "I reviewed the footage," he said, swiveling his monitor toward her, "and I think you'll want to see this." Leah leaned in, her stomach twisting with anticipation. On the screen, grainy black and white footage showed the loading dock on the day the package went missing. Workers moved back and forth, sorting mail and loading trucks. Then Leah spotted him, Tom Jenkins, a co-worker who had always seemed a little too interested in her business. In the video, Tom glanced around before picking up the package in question. Instead of placing it in the correct bin, he tossed it carelessly toward the shelf. It landed on the floor, and with a quick kick, he shoved it underneath. Leah's chest tightened. "Why would he do that?" Mr. Hargrove sighed. "I don't know, but it's clear this wasn't an accident. I'll handle Tom, and Leah." He hesitated, his tone softening. "I owe you an apology. You've handled this situation with grace and professionalism, and I'm sorry for doubting you." Leah nodded, her emotions a mix of relief and lingering frustration. "Thank you, sir. I just want to move forward." Later that day, Tom was called into the office and escorted out of the building, his employment terminated. Word spread quickly among the staff, and for the first time in weeks, Leah felt the weight of suspicion lift from her shoulders. But the experience had left its mark. She'd worked tirelessly to prove her innocence, and while she was glad the truth had come out, she couldn't ignore the way her co-workers had treated her during the investigation. Some had whispered behind her back, others had avoided her entirely, and a few had openly questioned her competence. Leah decided to address the issue head-on. During a staff meeting the following week, she stood up and spoke. "I know this hasn't been an easy time for anyone," she began, her voice steady. "But I want to say something. Being accused of something I didn't do was hard enough, but feeling like I didn't have the support of my team made it even harder." The room fell silent. Leah took a deep breath, continuing. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. We need to do better, not just in how we handle mistakes, but in how we treat each other. We're a team, and that should mean something." As she sat down, a few of her co-workers clapped, and one of them, Sarah, leaned over to whisper, "You're right, Leah. We'll do better." A few weeks later, Leah received a call from Mr. Hargrove asking her to come to his office. When she arrived, she found him smiling, a rare sight. "Leah, I wanted to thank you again for how you handled everything," he said. "And I have some news. Corporate was impressed with how you resolved the situation, and they've approved a promotion for you." Leah blinked, stunned. "A promotion?" "You're now the assistant manager of this branch," Mr. Hargrove said. "It's well deserved." Tears pricked Leah's eyes as she processed his words. She had worked hard for years, but this recognition felt especially meaningful after everything she'd endured. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." The promotion brought new responsibilities, but it also gave Leah a chance to make a difference. She implemented new protocols to prevent mishandling of packages, including better tracking systems and additional training for staff. She also worked to foster a more supportive work environment, encouraging open communication and teamwork. Slowly but surely, the culture of the post office began to change. Co-workers who had once kept their distance now approached Leah with questions and ideas, and even customers seemed to notice the shift in atmosphere. One day, the man whose package had gone missing returned to the post office. He approached Leah at the counter, an apologetic look on his face. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology. I was out of line when I accused you. Thank you for finding my package." Leah smiled, her tone gracious. "Apology accepted. I'm just glad we could make things right." As the man left, Leah felt a sense of closure. She had faced adversity and come out stronger, not just for herself, but for those around her. Months later, as Leah locked up the post office for the evening, she paused to look at the building she had called her workplace for so many years. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she had grown, fought for what was right, and found her voice. And as she walked to her car, the setting sun casting a warm glow over Maplewood, Leah knew she had built something more than a career. She had built trust, respect, and a legacy of resilience that would inspire others to do the same. The faint smell of motor oil and hot asphalt lingered in the air as Marcus Hill tightened the last bolt on a transmission. His small auto repair shop, nestled on the outskirts of Pinewood, was more than just a workplace. It was his sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the hum of engines and the rhythmic clang of tools, Marcus found purpose. Despite his skill and reputation as a reliable mechanic, Marcus often faced the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that permeated the small town. Some customers would barely make eye contact, others questioned his prices more harshly than they would anyone else. But Marcus had learned to let it roll off his back, focusing instead on the satisfaction of a job well done. One sweltering afternoon, the sound of tyres crunching on gravel caught Marcus's attention. He glanced up from under the hood of an old pickup to see a sleek, black sedan pulling into the lot. The car was immaculate, except for the faint trail of smoke curling from under its hood. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Samuel Reed. Marcus recognized him immediately. Samuel was a local businessman with a sharp tongue and a reputation for being cold, especially toward anyone who didn't fit his mold of acceptable. Marcus had seen Samuel in passing, but had never exchanged more than a curt nod. Samuel approached with an air of impatience, his tie loosened and his face pinched. "You Marcus Hill?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That's me," Marcus replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "My car's overheating," Samuel said, gesturing toward the sedan. "I need it fixed, fast." Marcus walked over, lifting the hood. The heat radiating from the engine made him step back momentarily. "Looks like a busted radiator," he said after a quick inspection. "It's not a quick fix, but I can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" Samuel's voice rose. "I need this car for a meeting tonight." Marcus straightened, meeting Samuel's gaze. "It's not a job I can rush. If I don't fix it properly, you'll be stranded on the side of the road again." Samuel muttered something under his breath, but Marcus caught it. Should have gone somewhere else. Marcus felt a pang of anger but forced himself to remain calm. "It's your choice," he said evenly. "But if you want it done right, I'll take care of it." Samuel hesitated, then threw up his hands. "Fine, just get it done." By the time Samuel left, Marcus was already elbows deep in the repair. He worked late into the night, the rhythmic sound of his tools punctuating the silence of the shop. Despite Samuel's attitude, Marcus couldn't bring himself to cut corners. He prided himself on his work, and he wasn't about to let anyone, friend or foe, drive off in a car that wasn't safe. As he tightened the last hose and wiped down the engine, Marcus leaned back and exhaled. The car was ready, and he'd made sure it was in top condition. The next afternoon, Samuel returned. He inspected the car as if searching for flaws, his expression unreadable. "It runs fine?" he asked, his tone begrudging. Better than fine, Marcus replied, handing over the keys. You're good to go. Samuel paid without a word of thanks, climbed into the car, and drove off. Marcus shook his head, returning to his work. He doubted he'd see Samuel again, and frankly, he wasn't in a hurry to. But fate had other plans. Weeks passed, and Marcus nearly forgot about Samuel Reed and his sleek sedan. He busied himself with a steady stream of customers, each repair reminding him why he loved his craft. But one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, a familiar car rolled into his lot. Samuel stepped out, his expression softer than before but still reserved. Got a minute? He asked. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, raising an eyebrow. What's the problem? No problem, Samuel said, almost sheepishly. Just wanted to say the car's been running perfectly since you worked on it, better than it ever has, so, thanks. Marcus nodded, caught off guard. Glad to hear it. Samuel hesitated, then added, and I might need your help with something else. Curiosity piqued, Marcus gestured for him to continue. It's my wife's car, Samuel explained. She's got an old Jeep, and it's been giving her trouble. I told her you'd take a look. The request surprised Marcus, but he agreed. Bring it by tomorrow. The next day, Samuel returned with the Jeep, and this time he lingered in the shop while Marcus worked. He asked questions about the tools, the parts, and even Marcus's process. Though his tone was still a bit guarded, there was a genuine interest behind his words. As the hours went by, the conversation turned more personal. Samuel asked how Marcus had gotten into auto repair, and Marcus shared his story, how his father had taught him to fix engines in their small backyard, how he'd saved up for years to open his own shop, and how he took pride in providing honest work. Samuel listened intently, his posture relaxing. You know, he said, I always assumed people in your line of work cut corners. But you don't. Nope, Marcus replied simply. A job's worth doing right, or it's not worth doing at all. Samuel nodded, as if weighing the words. I respect that. Over the next few months, Samuel became a regular at the shop. Whether it was his car, his wife's Jeep, or his daughter's old station wagon, he trusted Marcus to keep his family's vehicles running smoothly. But it wasn't just about the cars. Samuel began to linger after each visit, their conversations growing deeper and more personal. One evening, after Marcus had finished tuning up the station wagon, Samuel leaned against the counter and sighed. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the first time I came here. Oh? Marcus said, his tone neutral. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically vulnerable. I was rude. No, I was worse than rude. I judged you before I even knew you. Marcus set down the wrench he was holding and met Samuel's gaze. You did. Samuel winced, but didn't look away. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice caught Marcus off guard. For a moment he didn't know what to say. Finally he nodded. Takes a big man to admit that. Samuel let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing. Well, I owe you more than an apology. You've been nothing but honest and hard-working, and I respect the hell out of that. The turning point in their relationship came one stormy night. Marcus was locking up the shop when he heard a frantic knock at the door. It was Samuel, soaked from head to toe, his face pale with worry. It's my daughter, Samuel said. She broke down on Route 12, and her phone's dead. I don't know what to do. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his jacket and keys. Let's go. They drove through the rain, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. When they found Samuel's daughter, Emily, stranded on the side of the road, Marcus quickly assessed the situation. Her car's alternator had failed, leaving her without power. Within minutes, he had the car towed back to the shop and offered her a warm drink while he worked. As Samuel watched Marcus fix the car, his gratitude was palpable. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly, but you did. Marcus shrugged. It's what neighbours do. Samuel smiled faintly. I'm starting to realise that. From that night on, their relationship deepened into something unexpected. Friendship. Samuel began stopping by the shop, even when he didn't need a repair, bringing coffee or sandwiches and chatting with Marcus about everything from cars to family to the state of the world. Marcus found himself enjoying the conversations, appreciating the way Samuel's perspective had shifted. One day, Samuel brought Marcus a gift, a framed photo of the two of them standing in front of the shop, taken by Emily. "For the wall," Samuel said, grinning. Marcus laughed. "Guess this makes it official." Word of Marcus's integrity and skill spread throughout Pinewood, and his business thrived. But what meant more to him was the respect he'd earned, not just from Samuel, but from the community as a whole. People who had once looked past him now sought him out, eager to work with a man they knew they could trust. One evening, as Marcus locked up for the night, Samuel pulled up in his sedan. "Hey," he said, stepping out. "Thought you should know, I recommended you to a buddy of mine. He owns a fleet of trucks and needs someone reliable to maintain them." "Appreciate that," Marcus said, smiling. Samuel nodded, then added, "You've taught me a lot, Marcus. Not just about cars, but about people. I'm lucky to know you." Marcus shook his head, his grin widening. "We're both lucky, Samuel, and you're not such a bad guy yourself." As they stood there, the sun setting behind them, Marcus couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. What had started with hostility and prejudice had turned into something rare and meaningful, a friendship built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to doing what was right. And as Samuel drove away, Marcus knew this was more than just a story about fixing cars. It was a story about fixing hearts. Dr. Elijah Carter stood in the doorway of the old medical clinic, his suitcase by his side and hope in his heart. He had spent years working in bustling urban hospitals, honing his skills and saving lives. But after too many double shifts and sleepless nights, he longed for a quieter life where he could connect with patients on a deeper level. That longing had brought him to Meadowville, a picturesque but insular town nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest. The clinic had been closed for over a year since the previous doctor retired. Meadowville's residents had been driving miles to the nearest hospital for care, and Elijah had seen the job posting as an opportunity to make a difference. But as he walked through the empty hallways, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, he couldn't shake the feeling that this town wasn't ready to welcome him. Meadowville had a reputation for being slow to change. The people were polite but wary of outsiders, and Elijah's arrival had set off a ripple of whispered conversations. Some were curious about the new doctor, but others were less welcoming. "Don't know why we couldn't find someone local," one man muttered at the hardware store. "What does he know about us?" Elijah quickly learned that his credentials didn't matter to some. His skin colour seemed to matter more. The sideways glances, the cold shoulders, they spoke volumes. But Elijah refused to let the prejudice deter him. He set to work cleaning the clinic, ordering supplies and introducing himself around town. "Good morning, Mrs. Adler," he greeted a woman at the bakery one day. "I'm Dr. Carter. I just opened the clinic down the road." Mrs. Adler hesitated, her smile tight. "Oh, nice to meet you." The interaction was typical, polite, distant, and tinged with an unspoken barrier. Elijah often returned home at night, feeling like he was trying to scale an invisible wall. But he had faced challenges before, and he was determined to prove himself through his work. One day, as Elijah was unpacking boxes of medical equipment, a young boy burst into the clinic, tears streaming down his face. "Please, sir, it's my sister. She fell off her bike and she's bleeding bad." Elijah grabbed his bag and followed the boy to a nearby park. A girl, no older than 10, sat on the ground clutching her arm, blood trickling from a deep gash. Her mother hovered nearby, panic in her eyes. "Let me take a look," Elijah said gently, kneeling beside her. The mother hesitated but nodded, stepping aside. Elijah cleaned and dressed the wound with practiced efficiency, reassuring the girl as he worked. "You're very brave," he told her with a smile. "This will heal up just fine." The mother's tense expression softened. "Thank you, Doctor." "Carter," he replied, standing. "It's no trouble." Please bring her by the clinic for a follow-up." That day, word began to spread about the new doctor's skill and kindness. A few more patients trickled into the clinic over the next week, but the skepticism lingered. Elijah knew he had to do more to truly earn the town's trust. On the outskirts of Meadowville lived Jack Turner, a gruff, middle-aged farmer with a reputation for being as stubborn as the rocky soil he tilled. Jack was a vocal critic of Elijah's presence in town, often spouting his disdain at the local diner. "I don't need some outsider telling me how to take care of my health," he said one morning, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "What does he know about us?" Jack's words stung, but Elijah refused to respond. He focused on his work, knowing actions spoke louder than words. One humid evening, as Elijah was closing the clinic, he heard the screech of tires and a crash echo down the road. Grabbing his bag, he sprinted toward the sound. A pickup truck had veered off the road and smashed into a tree, its front end crumpled like a tin can. Elijah reached the vehicle and recognized Jack Turner slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling down his temple. The sight froze Elijah for a moment, but then his training kicked in. "Mr. Turner, can you hear me?" Elijah called, checking for a pulse. It was weak, but steady. He worked quickly, stabilizing Jack's neck and stopping the bleeding with a makeshift bandage. "Hang on, Jack," Elijah murmured. "I've got you." An ambulance arrived shortly after, and Jack was rushed to the nearest hospital. Elijah stayed behind, his clothes stained with blood, his heart heavy. He wondered if Jack would ever see him as more than an outsider. Jack Turner woke to the sound of steady beeping and the sterile scent of antiseptic. His head throbbed as he blinked against the fluorescent hospital lights. The last thing he remembered was the sharp screech of his tires, the truck spinning out of control. Now he was lying in a hospital bed, his wife Marjorie at his side, her eyes puffy from crying. "What happened?" he croaked, his voice rough and dry. "You were in an accident," Marjorie said softly, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. "Your truck hit a tree. It could have been much worse." Jack winced as he shifted in the bed. "How did I—" "Dr. Carter," Marjorie interrupted, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and sternness. "He found you. He saved your life." Jack froze, her words sinking in. "Carter, that new doctor. The one you've been bad-mouthing all over town," Marjorie said, her tone sharp now. "And yet, when you needed help, he didn't hesitate." Jack looked away, a knot forming in his chest. He had spent months criticizing Elijah, questioning his place in Meadowville, and now the man he'd dismissed and avoided had been the one to pull him from the wreckage. The irony wasn't lost on him, but it didn't sit easily either. Back in Meadowville, Elijah continued his routine, but Jack's accident lingered in his thoughts. He knew that saving Jack's life wouldn't instantly erase the prejudice he'd faced in the town. Still, he hoped it might be the start of something. 2 weeks later, Jack walked into the clinic for his follow-up appointment. His gait was slower than usual, and his eyes darted around as if he weren't sure he belonged there. Elijah greeted him warmly. "Mr. Turner," Elijah said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you on your feet." Jack hesitated before shaking it, his grip firm but brief. "Came to check on this shoulder," he said, his tone clipped. "Still feels stiff." "Let's take a look," Elijah said, gesturing toward the exam room. As Elijah worked, Jack remained quiet, watching the doctor with an expression that was hard to read. Elijah didn't push, focusing instead on making Jack comfortable. When the exam was over, Elijah gave him clear instructions for stretches and exercises to improve mobility. Jack lingered at the door, his hat clutched in his hands. "Why'd you do it?" he asked suddenly. Elijah looked up, puzzled. "Do what?" "Help me," Jack said, "after the way I've treated you." Elijah smiled faintly. "Because it's my job," he said simply, "and because everyone deserves care no matter what." Jack nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Elijah watched him go, wondering if he'd ever truly understand. Word of Elijah's actions spread through Meadowville like wildfire. The man who had once been met with suspicion was now the subject of admiration. Patients who had avoided the clinic began trickling in, bringing baked goods and small tokens of appreciation. The whispered doubts about Elijah's abilities faded, replaced by stories of his skill and compassion. One morning, as Elijah unlocked the clinic, he found a basket of fresh produce sitting by the door. A simple note was tucked inside. "Thank you for what you do." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. The town's attitude was shifting, but he knew it would take more than a single act of heroism to truly break down the walls that had been built over decades. Jack, meanwhile, wrestled with his own transformation. The man who prided himself on self-reliance was now faced with the uncomfortable truth that he had needed help, and that help had come from someone he had dismissed. For weeks, he kept to himself, avoiding the diner and the familiar faces of friends who would surely ask about his recovery. But the weight of guilt and gratitude grew heavier. One afternoon, Jack gathered a basket of tomatoes and squash from his garden and drove to the clinic. When he walked in, Elijah looked up from the front desk, his eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. Turner," Elijah said, setting down his pen. "What can I do for you?" Jack cleared his throat, setting the basket on the counter. "Thought you might like some fresh vegetables," he muttered. Elijah's smile was warm. "Thank you. That's very kind." Jack hesitated, then added, "Listen, Doc. I've been wrong about you. Judged you without giving you a fair chance. And for that, I'm sorry." Elijah extended a hand, his voice steady. "Apology accepted, Jack. Let's move forward." Jack shook his hand firmly, a gesture that felt more significant than words. For the first time, he saw Elijah not as an outsider, but as a man who had chosen to help, even when he didn't have to. The clinic flourished in the months that followed. Elijah organised free health screenings for farmers during harvest season and started a community wellness program that taught first aid and basic healthcare skills. These efforts deepened his connection to the town, making the clinic a hub of activity and care. Jack became one of Elijah's strongest supporters. At the diner, where he had once voiced his doubts, he now spoke up in the doctor's defence. "The man saved my life," he said firmly, "and he's doing a damn good job for this town." The shift in Jack's attitude didn't go unnoticed. His friends, who had once echoed his skepticism, began to soften as well. If Jack Turner could change his mind, maybe they could too. One day, Elijah was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about the importance of accessible healthcare. The room was packed, and as Elijah stood at the podium, he felt a surge of nerves. But when he looked out at the crowd, he saw Jack sitting in the front row, his expression one of quiet encouragement. Elijah spoke about his journey to Meadowville, the challenges he'd faced, and the resilience of the community he had come to care deeply about. "Healthcare isn't just about medicine," he said. "It's about trust, compassion, and the willingness to see each other as equals." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Jack was the first to stand, clapping loudly. Elijah's chest swelled with pride and gratitude. Years later, Elijah looked back on his time in Meadowville with a sense of fulfillment. The town had grown to embrace him not just as a doctor, but as a friend and neighbour. The clinic, once a symbol of doubt, was now a cornerstone of the community. As for Jack, he became an advocate for unity, often sharing his story of how Elijah had saved his life and changed his perspective. Their unlikely friendship became a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength of human connection. On the clinic's 5th anniversary, the town gathered to celebrate. Jack stood beside Elijah, holding a plaque that read, "To Dr. Elijah Carter, for healing not just bodies, but hearts." Elijah accepted it with a smile, his eyes glistening. "This isn't just for me," he said. "It's for all of us, for the community we've built together." As the crowd cheered, Elijah felt a profound sense of purpose. He had come to Meadowville as a stranger, but he had found a home. And in the process, he had shown that even the deepest divides could be bridged by kindness, perseverance, and the courage to believe in change. The roaring crowd filled the arena, their cheers and chants reverberating off the steel beams. On the track, Elijah Eli Thompson adjusted his spikes and took a deep breath, trying to block out the noise and the stares. As one of the few black athletes in the regional track circuit, he had grown accustomed to the whispers, the side glances, and occasionally the outright hostility. But today felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. At the starting line, his main rival, Nate Carter, smirked as he adjusted his headband. "Hope you can keep up, Thompson," Nate said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Wouldn't want you to trip over your ego." Eli clenched his jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. Nate was the hometown favourite, a tall blonde sprinter with a cocky demeanour and an uncanny knack for riling up his competitors. The two had faced off many times, and while Eli had beaten Nate before, the victories never came without a price. The taunts, the glares from fans, the subtle and not so subtle reminders that Eli wasn't one of them. "You'll need more than words to win," Eli shot back, his voice calm but firm. The official called the racers to their positions, and Eli focused on the lane ahead. The 400-metre dash wasn't just a race to him, it was a test of resilience, a chance to prove that he belonged, no matter what anyone thought. The gunshot echoed, and the racers exploded off the blocks. Eli's heart pounded as he found his rhythm, his legs churning like pistons. For a moment it was just him and the track, the roar of the crowd fading into the background. But as he rounded the final curve, the noise returned, and with it, the jeers. "Go back where you came from," someone shouted. Eli gritted his teeth, pushing harder. He passed Nate in the final stretch, his body straining as he crossed the finish line a fraction of a second ahead. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in a mixture of cheers and boos. As Eli caught his breath, Nate approached, his face flushed with anger. "Don't get used to it, Thompson," he spat. "This was a fluke." Eli stared at him, his chest heaving. "Maybe next time you'll focus on running instead of talking." Nate sneered and walked away, leaving Eli alone at the finish line. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the animosity that clung to the air. Back in the locker room, Eli sat on the bench, his head in his hands. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. His coach, Coach Ramirez, sat beside him. "You did good out there, kid," the coach said, his tone encouraging. "Did I?" Eli replied, his voice laced with frustration. "Doesn't feel like it." Coach Ramirez sighed. "You're not just running a race, Eli. You're challenging a lot of people's assumptions. That's not easy, but it's important." Eli nodded, though the words offered little comfort. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting this uphill battle. The next few meets followed a similar pattern. Eli ran his races, often finishing in the top 3, but the hostility remained. Nate was relentless, always finding new ways to undermine him. "You're fast, Thompson," Nate said after one race, "but you'll never be a real champion. Not here." Eli wanted to snap back, to tell Nate exactly what he thought of him, but he held his tongue, channeling his anger into his training instead. Then came the state championship, a high-stakes event that drew athletes and spectators from across the region. Eli and Nate were both favourites to win, their rivalry the talk of the circuit. As the racers warmed up, the tension was palpable. This wasn't just a race, it was a proving ground. Eli stood at the starting line, his muscles coiled like springs. He could feel the weight of the crowd's expectations, both for and against him. Beside him, Nate grinned, his confidence unshaken. "Ready to lose, Thompson?" Nate taunted. "Ready to run," Eli replied, his voice steady. The official raised the gun, and the crowd fell silent. The race began with an electric energy surging through the stadium. Eli's feet pounded against the track, his movements fluid and powerful. Each stride carried him closer to the finish line, his focus razor-sharp. Nate was just ahead, their rivalry fueling the tension that gripped the crowd. For a moment, it was only the race that mattered, until it wasn't. Eli saw it first, a wobble in Nate's stride, the subtle loss of rhythm. In the blink of an eye, Nate's foot clipped the edge of the track, and his body twisted awkwardly before crashing onto the asphalt. He let out a sharp cry, clutching his leg as the momentum scraped him across the rough surface. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Eli's instincts kicked in. He slowed his pace, the finish line just meters away, and glanced back at Nate writhing on the ground. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but only one stood out. He needs help. Without hesitation, Eli stopped and turned around. The decision cost him the race, but in that moment, winning didn't matter. He sprinted back to Nate, kneeling beside him as the other racers charged past. "Hey, stay still," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "What hurts?" Nate's face twisted in pain. "My ankle. I think it's broken." Eli looked down at Nate's swollen, discoloured ankle and winced. "You'll be okay," he said. "I've got you." The medics arrived moments later, their stretcher and medical bags in tow. They worked quickly, stabilising Nate's leg, but Eli didn't move from his side. He held Nate's shoulder, offering reassurance as the crowd murmured in the background. "You didn't have to stop," Nate muttered, his voice strained. "Why'd you do it?" Eli met his gaze, his expression steady. "Because it was the right thing to do." Nate didn't respond, but the flicker of gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. As the medics carried Nate off the track, Eli stood and dusted off his hands. He turned toward the finish line, which seemed impossibly far now. The race was long over, the winners already celebrating, but Eli jogged to the end anyway. When he crossed, the crowd erupted, not with the usual half-hearted applause, but with a thunderous standing ovation. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of their acknowledgement, their cheers filled with something he hadn't experienced here before. Genuine respect. After the race, Eli sat in the locker room, his body exhausted, but his mind restless. He replayed the events over and over, wondering if he had made the right decision. He had sacrificed a hard-earned opportunity to win, but somehow the victory didn't seem as important anymore. Coach Ramirez walked in, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "That was one hell of a move, Eli," he said, sitting beside him. "I didn't even finish in the top 3, Eli replied, his tone laced with doubt. Coach Ramirez shook his head. "You did something bigger than winning a race. People saw who you really are today. That matters more than any medal." Eli nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had spent so long fighting for recognition, for a place in a world that seemed determined to push him out. Today, he had shown them something they couldn't ignore. In the days following the race, Eli's actions became the talk of the community. Videos of the moment went viral, shared widely with captions praising his sportsmanship and selflessness. For the first time, Eli felt seen, not just as a competitor, but as a person. The transformation wasn't limited to the crowd. Nate, once so arrogant and dismissive, began to change too. After the doctors confirmed his ankle was fractured, he reached out to Eli with an unexpected request. "Can we talk?" Nate said, finding Eli in the training room a week later. Eli raised an eyebrow, surprised but curious. "Sure." Nate hesitated, his usual cocky demeanour replaced by something softer. "I've been a jerk," he admitted. "Not just to you, to a lot of people. I guess I thought being on top meant keeping everyone else down." Eli folded his arms, waiting. "But what you did out there," Nate continued, his voice faltering. "It made me realise I've been wrong. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'm grateful." Eli studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "It's never too late to change." Nate smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Thanks for everything." The next time they raced, the atmosphere was different. The animosity that had once defined their rivalry was gone, replaced by mutual respect. Before the race began, Nate extended a fist toward Eli. "Let's give them something to cheer for," Nate said. Eli grinned, bumping his fist. "Let's do it." As the race unfolded, the two pushed each other to their limits, their strides synchronized in a display of pure athleticism. When they crossed the finish line, Eli just a fraction ahead, the crowd erupted, their cheers louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just about who won. It was about what the race had come to represent: resilience, unity, and the power of doing what's right. The ripple effects of Eli's actions extended far beyond the track. Athletes who had once ignored him now sought him out, asking for advice and offering encouragement. Fans who had jeered him in the past now cheered his name, their attitudes shifting as they recognized the strength of his character. Even the local media took notice, writing articles about the transformative power of sportsmanship. One piece, titled "The Runner Who Stopped," highlighted Eli's choice to prioritize humanity over victory, calling it a moment that redefined what it means to be a champion. Months later, at a community event honoring local athletes, Eli and Nate stood side by side, receiving awards for their contributions to the sport. As they took the stage, Nate leaned toward the microphone. Without hesitation, Eli stopped and turned around. The decision cost him the race, but in that moment, winning didn't matter. He sprinted back to Nate, kneeling beside him as the other racers charged past. "Hey, stay still," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "What hurts?" Nate's face twisted in pain. "My ankle. I think it's broken." Eli looked down at Nate's swollen, discolored ankle and winced. "You'll be okay," he said. "I've got you." The medics arrived moments later, their stretcher and medical bags in tow. They worked quickly, stabilizing Nate's leg, but Eli didn't move from his side. He held Nate's shoulder, offering reassurance as the crowd murmured in the background. "You didn't have to stop," Nate muttered, his voice strained. "Why'd you do it?" Eli met his gaze, his expression steady. "Because it was the right thing to do." Nate didn't respond, but the flicker of gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. As the medics carried Nate off the track, Eli stood and dusted off his hands. He turned toward the finish line, which seemed impossibly far now. The race was long over, the winners already celebrating, but Eli jogged to the end anyway. When he crossed, the crowd erupted, not with the usual half-hearted applause, but with a thunderous standing ovation. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of their acknowledgement, their cheers filled with something he hadn't experienced here before: genuine respect. After the race, Eli sat in the locker room, his body exhausted, but his mind restless. He replayed the events over and over, wondering if he had made the right decision. He had sacrificed a hard-earned opportunity to win, but somehow the victory didn't seem as important anymore. Coach Ramirez walked in, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "That was one hell of a move, Eli," he said, sitting beside him. "I didn't even finish in the top 3, Eli replied, his tone laced with doubt. Coach Ramirez shook his head. "You did something bigger than winning a race. People saw who you really are today. That matters more than any medal." Eli nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had spent so long fighting for recognition, for a place in a world that seemed determined to push him out. Today, he had shown them something they couldn't ignore. In the days following the race, Eli's actions became the talk of the community. Videos of the moment went viral, shared widely with captions praising his sportsmanship and selflessness. For the first time, Eli felt seen, not just as a competitor, but as a person. The transformation wasn't limited to the crowd. Nate, once so arrogant and dismissive, began to change too. After the doctors confirmed his ankle was fractured, he reached out to Eli with an unexpected request. "Can we talk?" Nate said, finding Eli in the training room a week later. Eli raised an eyebrow, surprised but curious. "Sure." Nate hesitated, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something softer. "I've been a jerk," he admitted. "Not just to you, to a lot of people. I guess I thought being on top meant keeping everyone else down." Eli folded his arms, waiting. "But what you did out there," Nate continued, his voice faltering. "It made me realize I've been wrong. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'm grateful." Eli studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. It's never too late to change. Nate smiled, a small but genuine gesture. Thanks for everything. The next time they raced, the atmosphere was different. The animosity that had once defined their rivalry was gone, replaced by mutual respect. Before the race began, Nate extended a fist toward Eli. "Let's give them something to cheer for," Nate said. Eli grinned, bumping his fist. "Let's do it." As the race unfolded, the two pushed each other to their limits, their strides synchronized in a display of pure athleticism. When they crossed the finish line, Eli just a fraction ahead, the crowd erupted, their cheers louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just about who won. It was about what the race had come to represent: resilience, unity, and the power of doing what's right. The ripple effects of Eli's actions extended far beyond the track. Athletes who had once ignored him now sought him out, asking for advice and offering encouragement. Fans who had jeered him in the past now cheered his name, their attitudes shifting as they recognized the strength of his character. Even the local media took notice, writing articles about the transformative power of sportsmanship. One piece, titled "The Runner Who Stopped," highlighted Eli's choice to prioritize humanity over victory, calling it a moment that redefined what it means to be a champion. Months later, at a community event honoring local athletes, Eli and Nate stood side by side, receiving awards for their contributions to the sport. As they took the stage, Nate leaned toward the microphone. "I used to think being a winner meant crossing the finish line first," Nate said, his voice steady. "But Eli taught me it's about more than that. It's about how you treat people along the way." The audience erupted into applause, and Eli felt a warmth spread through him. For so long, he had fought to be seen, to prove his worth. Now he stood on a stage, not as an outsider, but as a leader, a reminder of what could happen when people chose compassion over competition. As the applause continued, Eli glanced at Nate and smiled. "I couldn't have said it better myself." Years later, Eli looked back on that race as a turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. The decision to stop had cost him a medal, but it had given him something far more valuable: a sense of purpose, a chance to inspire change, and the knowledge that one act of kindness could ripple outward in ways he had never imagined. And as he laced up his spikes for another race, he knew that no matter what happened, he had already won. Jalen had always known how people saw him. Growing up as a young black man in a suburban neighborhood meant constantly navigating suspicion, sidelong glances, and the ever-present hum of mistrust. That night was no different. He had just finished a late study session at the local library, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, when he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. "Great," he muttered, pulling over to the curb. The officer approached with a deliberate stride, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. Jalen lowered his window, already reaching for his license and registration. He knew the routine. Keep your hands visible. Be polite. Don't give them a reason to escalate. "License and registration," the officer barked. Jalen complied, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man, whose name badge read Thompson, ignored the question. His sharp eyes flicked between Jalen's face and his documents. "What are you doing out here this late?" "I was at the library," Jalen said evenly. "Heading home now." Thompson didn't respond right away. He seemed distracted, glancing back at his squad car, where the radio crackled faintly. His face was tight with tension, his posture stiff. Jalen frowned. He could tell something was off. "Are you okay?" he asked cautiously. Thompson's head snapped back toward him. "What?" "You seem distracted," Jalen said, careful to keep his tone neutral. For a moment, Thompson's stern mask cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "It's none of your business," he said gruffly, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. Jalen hesitated, debating whether to push further. Against his better judgment, he spoke again. "Look, I know I'm just some guy you pulled over, but maybe I can help. What's going on?" The officer stared at him, clearly torn. Finally, as if the weight of whatever he was carrying was too much to bear, He exhaled sharply. "It's my daughter," he admitted. "She ran off after a fight. She's not answering her phone, and I don't know where she is." Jalen's chest tightened. "How old is she?" 14, Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jalen nodded, his mind racing. "Have you checked the places she usually goes? Friends' houses? Parks?" "I've checked everywhere I can think of," Thompson said, frustration etched into his features. "She's out there somewhere, and it's getting colder by the minute." Jalen glanced at the officer's squad car, then back at him. He could walk away, this wasn't his problem. But something in Thompson's voice, the sheer desperation, made it impossible to turn his back. "I'll help you look," Jalen said firmly. Thompson blinked. "What?" "I'll help," Jalen repeated. "Two sets of eyes are better than one, right?" Thompson hesitated, clearly wrestling with the idea. But finally he nodded. "Fine. But you stick close." The search took them across the quiet suburban streets, the air growing colder as the night deepened. They started with the nearby park, its empty swing set creaking in the wind. Then they checked a strip of fast food restaurants, their neon signs casting eerie glows on the deserted sidewalks. As they walked, Jalen tried to break the silence. "You said she ran off after a fight. What happened?" Thompson sighed, his flashlight sweeping over a row of empty benches. "I told her she couldn't go to a party. She's been hanging around with this group of kids I don't trust. I wanted to keep her safe." Jalen nodded. "Sounds like you care about her a lot." "Of course I do," Thompson snapped, then softened. "She's all I've got since her mum passed away." Jalen's heart ached at the raw pain in the man's voice. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. They searched for hours, their shared goal creating an unlikely bond. At one point, they stopped at a deserted bus stop, its flickering fluorescent light casting strange shadows. Jalen noticed a girl's scarf caught on a nearby bush, its vibrant blue fabric standing out against the darkness. "Over here," he called, holding up the scarf. Thompson's eyes widened as he grabbed it. "It's hers." Jalen's pulse quickened. "She can't be far." They followed a narrow path behind the bus stop, the air growing colder and the trees denser. Finally, they spotted her, a small figure huddled beneath a cluster of bushes, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Emma!" Thompson called, his voice breaking. The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and frightened. "Dad!" Thompson rushed forward, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his arms. "Oh, thank God," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Jalen hung back, watching the reunion with a mixture of relief and warmth. He didn't want to intrude on the moment, but he couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at his lips. After a few minutes, Thompson turned to him, his face a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Shame. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this." Jalen shrugged. "She's just a kid. Kids shouldn't have to be out here alone." Thompson hesitated, then added, "Look, I owe you an apology. When I pulled you over, I assumed things about you, things that weren't fair." Jalen met his gaze evenly. "You're not the first, won't be the last." "That doesn't make it right," Thompson said, his voice firm. "Tonight, you showed me something I didn't want to see, that I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things." Jalen didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "Maybe next time you'll think twice." "I will," Thompson promised. "You have my word." As Thompson drove away with Emma safely beside him, Jalen stood alone under the flickering light of the bus stop. The night was quiet now, the chaos and tension of the search fading into stillness. Jalen exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. He hadn't planned to be anyone's hero, but tonight he had made a difference. And as he started walking home, the weight of the evening settling over him, he allowed himself to hope, just for a moment, that the world could change. One small act of kindness at a time, The first day of school at Brookfield High was always a mixture of excitement and chaos. Students shuffled through the hallways, their laughter and chatter echoing off the polished floors. Teachers greeted each other with smiles, swapping summer stories as they prepared for the year ahead. For Cameron Ellis, this wasn't just the start of a new school year, it was the beginning of a new chapter. At 32, Cameron was stepping into his first role as a full-time history teacher. A tall, soft-spoken man with a passion for education, he had dreamed of this opportunity for years. But as he walked into the faculty lounge that morning, he couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The glances started almost immediately, quick, fleeting looks from some of his colleagues as he introduced himself. A few smiled warmly, but others kept their distance, their expressions unreadable. Cameron had grown used to this reaction in his life, but it didn't make it any easier. "Mr. Ellis, right?" A woman with curly blonde hair approached him, her hand outstretched. "I'm Jessica Green. I teach English next door to your classroom. Welcome to Brookfield." "Thank you," Cameron said, shaking her hand. "I'm excited to be here." Jessica's smile was genuine, and Cameron felt a small wave of relief. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," she said, before heading back to her desk. As the bell rang, signalling the start of first period, Cameron gathered his materials and made his way to his classroom. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. 20 pairs of eyes turned to him, some curious, others bored, and a few already sizing him up. "Good morning, everyone," Cameron said, his voice steady. "My name is Mr. Ellis, and I'll be your history teacher this year." The first week passed in a blur of lesson plans and introductions. Most of the students were polite, though a few seemed determined to test his patience. It wasn't until the end of the week that Cameron encountered his first real challenge. During a lecture on Reconstruction, a student named Tyler muttered something under his breath. Cameron couldn't catch the words, but the smirks from the other students told him it wasn't complimentary. "Care to share with the class, Tyler?" Cameron asked, his tone firm but calm. Tyler shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Just saying it's funny how someone like you is teaching this stuff. Seems ironic." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Cameron's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "History has a lot to teach us about irony," he said evenly, "and respect." The laughter faded, and Tyler's smirk disappeared. But the moment lingered in Cameron's mind, long after the bell rang. The incidents became more frequent as the weeks went on. Snide comments, whispered jokes, and subtle acts of defiance. Cameron recognized the undercurrent of prejudice, and though it hurt, he refused to let it show. He focused on his lessons, determined to prove himself through his work. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult class, Cameron stayed late to grade papers. The school was quiet, the hallways empty, when he heard the squeak of a mop bucket. He glanced out the door and saw the janitor, a wiry elderly man with a weathered face, cleaning the floor. "Long day?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. "You could say that," Cameron replied, stepping into the hallway. The janitor smiled, leaning on his mop. "Kids giving you trouble?" Cameron hesitated, then nodded. "A little. Nothing I can't handle." "I'm sure you can," the man said, "but it doesn't make it any less exhausting." Cameron chuckled softly. "You've been here a while, I take it?" "Longer than most," the man said. "Name's Mr. Carter. If you need anything, just holler." "Thanks, Mr. Carter," Cameron said, extending a hand. "I'm Cameron." As they shook hands, Cameron noticed the strength in the older man's grip, a testament to years of hard work. There was something steadying about his presence, and Cameron felt a small flicker of hope. Over the next few weeks, Cameron and Mr. Carter developed an easy rapport. They often crossed paths after school, sharing brief conversations about life, work, and the challenges of dealing with unruly students. Cameron learned that Mr. Carter had been at Brookfield for decades, though he rarely talked about his past. One evening, as Cameron packed up his bag, he saw Mr. Carter struggling to lift a heavy box in the supply closet. Without hesitation, Cameron rushed over to help. "Let me get that," Cameron said, hoisting the box with ease. "Appreciate it," Mr. Carter said, brushing the dust off his hands. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." "What's in here anyway?" Cameron asked, setting the box down on a nearby table. "Just some old records," Mr. Carter replied. "Probably should have been tossed years ago." Cameron glanced at the label on the box, Principal's Office, 1985 to 1995. He looked at Mr. Carter, his curiosity piqued. "You were a principal?" Mr. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "A long time ago, this was my school." Cameron's eyes widened. "What happened?" Mr. Carter sighed, his gaze distant. "That's a story for another day." Cameron wanted to press him, but something in Mr. Carter's tone made him hold back. Instead, he nodded and said, "Whenever you're ready." Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Mr. Ellis. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The following week, Cameron couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Mr. Carter. A principal turned janitor? The thought unsettled him, not because of the position itself, but because of the unspoken weight behind Mr. Carter's words. He sensed there was more to the story, something important. One evening after school, Cameron found Mr. Carter sweeping the hallway outside the library. He approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "Mr. Carter," Cameron began, "I've been thinking about what you told me last week. If you're willing, I'd really like to hear your story." Mr. Carter leaned on his broom, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, Cameron thought he might refuse, but then the older man nodded. "All right, Mr. Ellis, let's take a walk." They ended up in the school's empty cafeteria, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. Mr. Carter sat heavily at one of the tables, gesturing for Cameron to join him. "This school used to be my pride and joy," Mr. Carter began, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I started teaching here in the late 70s, back when the town was still adjusting to integration. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of folks who didn't want someone like me in a position of authority. But I worked hard, built relationships, and eventually earned their respect." Cameron listened intently, picturing a younger Mr. Carter walking these same hallways, his presence commanding yet kind. "In 1985, I became the first black principal of Brookfield High," Mr. Carter continued. "For a while, it felt like progress. I pushed for changes, more inclusive curricula, programs to support underprivileged students. Some people embraced it, others, not so much." His voice grew quieter, his gaze distant. Then came the scandal. Cameron leaned forward. "What happened?" "There was a fight," Mr. Carter said, his jaw tightening. "Two boys, one black, one white, got into it during lunch. The white boy threw the first punch, but the other kid fought back harder. I disciplined them both, like the handbook said, but the parents weren't happy. The white boy's father accused me of being biased, claimed I was trying to ruin his son's future." Cameron frowned. "That's ridiculous." "It didn't matter," Mr. Carter said bitterly. "The school board launched an investigation. They didn't find anything, of course, but by then, the damage was done. My reputation was tarnished, and the board pressured me to resign. I didn't fight it. I thought stepping down would protect the school, but looking back I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder." "And after that?" Cameron asked. "I couldn't leave this place," Mr. Carter admitted. "I love this school, these kids, so I stayed on as a janitor, quietly doing what I could to make a difference." Cameron felt a surge of anger and admiration. "You've done more than most people ever would. The students here are lucky to have you." Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Mr. Ellis, and so are you." The next day, Cameron walked into his classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Mr. Carter's story had reminded him why he'd become a teacher, to make a difference, even in the face of adversity. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. After school, Cameron approached Jessica Green in the faculty lounge. "Jessica, can I talk to you about something?" "Of course," she said, setting down her coffee. "What's on your mind?" Cameron hesitated, then said, "I've been struggling with how some of the students, and even a few staff members, treat me." but I think it's bigger than me. There's a culture here that needs to change." Jessica nodded, her expression serious. "You're not wrong. I've noticed it too, and I've been meaning to say something. What do you have in mind?" Cameron explained his idea, a school-wide initiative to foster respect, inclusion, and understanding. He wanted to create workshops, invite guest speakers, and even incorporate lessons about equity and empathy into the curriculum. Jessica listened intently, her enthusiasm growing. "I'm in," she said firmly. "And I think I know a few other teachers who'd want to help." With Jessica's support, Cameron began working on the initiative. He also enlisted Mr. Carter's help, knowing his story could inspire both staff and students. At first, Mr. Carter was hesitant. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight anymore, but Cameron convinced him that his voice was essential. The first workshop took place in the auditorium, attended by students, teachers, and even a few parents. Cameron opened with a heartfelt speech about his own experiences, emphasizing the importance of kindness and understanding. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Carter took the stage. The room fell silent as Mr. Carter shared his story. He spoke about his journey as an educator, the challenges he'd faced, and the love he still had for the school despite everything. His words were honest, powerful, and deeply moving. When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. For the first time in years, Mr. Carter stood tall, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of his past. The initiative gained momentum in the weeks that followed. Students who had once been skeptical began participating in discussions and activities, their perspectives shifting as they learned more about each other. Teachers who had been indifferent started embracing the changes, recognizing the positive impact on the school community. Even Tyler, the student who had mocked Cameron on his first day, approached him after class one afternoon. "Mr. Ellis," he said awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way I acted." Cameron smiled, his voice warm. "Apology accepted, Tyler. Let's move forward." By the end of the school year, Brookfield High was a different place. The halls were filled with laughter and conversation, the barriers between students and staff beginning to fade. Cameron and Mr. Carter had become a formidable team, their partnership a testament to the power of resilience and understanding. On the last day of school, the faculty held a small celebration in honor of Mr. Carter. The principal, who had been inspired by the initiative, presented him with a plaque that read, "To Mr. Carter, whose dedication and courage remind us all what it means to lead." As Mr. Carter accepted the plaque, he turned to Cameron with a smile. "You did this," he said quietly. "No," Cameron replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "We did this." And as the room erupted into applause, Cameron felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come to Brookfield hoping to make a difference, but he had gained so much more: a friend, a mentor, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ignite change. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. The city block he walked through was familiar, but not friendly, a landscape of graffiti-covered walls and shuttered storefronts. Sirens blared in the distance, a constant reminder that trouble was never far. At 16, Malik had learned how to avoid it. Head down, hood up, and eyes fixed straight ahead. Today was no different, except that trouble felt closer than usual. He rounded a corner and almost collided with an older white woman, struggling with two heavy grocery bags. The plastic stretched thin, threatening to spill their contents onto the sidewalk. Her frail hands gripped the handles tightly, knuckles white with effort. She looked up, her eyes cautious but weary, scanning Malik's face with a mix of uncertainty and exhaustion. Malik hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep moving, don't get involved, stay invisible. Yet, something in her eyes, or maybe the way her hands trembled, made him stop. Need some help? His voice was soft, almost unsure. The woman blinked, surprised. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the noise of the city swirling around them. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. "Oh, Well, yes, if you're not in a hurry. He wasn't. Not really. With a nod, he reached for the bags. The weight surprised him. They were heavier than they looked. They walked in silence at first, an invisible chasm of generations, experiences, and unspoken words stretching between them. The sidewalk beneath them was cracked and uneven, each step a careful negotiation. "I'm Mrs. Henderson," she offered eventually, her voice breaking the silence. "You live around here?" "Yeah," Malik replied, shifting the bags to balance the load. "A few blocks over. I'm Malik." "Malik," she repeated, as if tasting the name. "Thank you, Malik. My son usually helps me with the groceries, but he's busy today." He didn't ask why. It wasn't his business. They continued walking, the silence more comfortable now. Malik noticed the small details, the way Mrs. Henderson's shoes were scuffed, the careful way she navigated the uneven pavement. Each step seemed deliberate, as if she were measuring the distance not just in feet, but in years. They reached her apartment building, a faded brick structure with peeling paint and rusted fire escapes. The windows were small, some covered with old curtains. She fumbled with the keys at the entrance, her hands trembling slightly. Malik noticed but said nothing. He knew pride when he saw it. "Thank you again," she said as the door swung open. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of old books and something floral. The hallway was narrow, lined with framed photographs that hinted at a life Malik couldn't quite imagine. She led him to her apartment on the second floor. The place was small but tidy, filled with knickknacks and mementos that spoke of a long life well lived. There was a quilt on the sofa, a stack of magazines on the coffee table, and a clock that ticked too loudly in the quiet room. "Just set them on the counter, dear," she said, pointing to the small kitchen. Malik did as she asked, carefully placing the bags down. "Can I offer you some water?" she asked, catching her breath. "No, thanks. I should get going." Before she could respond, a knock at the door startled them both. It was sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that made Malik's stomach clench. He knew that knock. Police. Mrs. Henderson opened the door to reveal a tall man in uniform. His presence filled the small entryway. His badge caught the light, a cold reminder of the authority it carried. Malik's eyes flicked to the name tag, D. Henderson. "Mum, are you okay?" The officer's eyes scanned the room, landing on Malik with a look that was equal parts suspicion and assessment. "I'm fine, David," Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone exasperated. "This young man helped me with my groceries." The officer's posture relaxed slightly, but the wariness in his eyes remained. "Thank you for helping my mother," he said, the words clipped and formal. "I'll take it from here." Malik nodded, the invisible line between them growing thicker. Without another word, he left, the door closing softly behind him. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, the air heavier. He shoved his hands in his pockets, head down, and walked faster. Outside, the city noise seemed louder, pressing in from all sides. He didn't look back. Back on the street, Malik's mind raced. His pulse still pounded from the encounter. He hadn't done anything wrong, he knew that. Yet the tension in Officer Henderson's eyes felt like an accusation. It was the look Malik had seen too many times before, a silent judgment that followed him through the city. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, his feet moving faster, as if trying to outrun the memory. The afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting the streets in shadows. The neighbourhood around him was a patchwork of contradictions. Old brick buildings standing beside new developments, murals of community pride next to boarded-up shops. Malik walked through it all, his thoughts replaying the moment over and over. Why did it bother him so much? He had helped someone, done the right thing. But that look, it felt like a reminder that for some people, his actions would always be questioned. He kicked a stray bottle cap, watching it skitter across the pavement. Inside the apartment, David Henderson watched the door close behind Malik. His jaw tightened. The boy's silence, the way he'd walked out without a word, it gnawed at him. He turned back to his mother, who was watching him with a look he hadn't seen in years. Disappointment. "You judged him," she said softly. David looked away, his hands resting on his utility belt. "I have to be careful, Mum. You know that. It's my job." Careful? Or biased? Her voice was calm, but the words cut deep. She crossed the room, sitting down slowly in the armchair by the window. The light caught the edges of her face, highlighting the lines etched by years of living and of worrying. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. I've seen things out there. I can't afford to be naive. And I've lived long enough to know that kindness deserves better than suspicion." She shook her head, her gaze distant. "That boy, he reminded me of someone." David frowned. "Who?" "Your father." The room fell silent. David's father had died when he was a teenager, a casualty of the very streets David now patrolled. It was part of why he'd become a cop, to make sure fewer families had to face that kind of loss. But hearing his mother compare a stranger to the man he'd idolized, it made something inside him twist. "He was always helping people," she continued, "even when it wasn't safe, even when others doubted him." David didn't respond. He couldn't. The image of Malik, standing there with those heavy grocery bags, stayed with him. The next day, Malik sat at the back of a community meeting. He hadn't planned to go, but his neighbour, Mr. Jackson, had insisted. "Your voice matters," he'd said, his eyes serious. So here he was, surrounded by people he didn't know, in a room that felt too small and too loud. The meeting was about neighbourhood safety. The usual complaints filled the air. Too much crime, not enough trust in the police. Malik listened, his arms crossed, feeling invisible. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "We need to bridge the gap," Chief Henderson said, standing at the front. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Malik. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we can start by listening." Malik scoffed under his breath. Listening? He doubted it. People like him had been talking for years, and nothing had changed. After the meeting, Malik made his way to the exit, his head down. He didn't expect to hear his name. "Malik." He turned, finding himself face to face with Chief Henderson. The man's posture was different now, less rigid, more uncertain. "Chief," Malik replied, his voice guarded. Henderson hesitated. "Thank you for helping my mom." Malik shrugged. Anyone would have. "But they didn't," Henderson said quietly. His eyes searched Malik's face, as if trying to see something beyond the surface. "We're starting a youth advisory council. Voices like yours could help bridge gaps. You interested?" Malik studied him, searching for the catch. "Why me?" "Because you see things I don't, and I need to learn." The first meeting of the advisory council was awkward. 5 teenagers and 2 officers sitting in a circle of mismatched chairs. Malik didn't say much at first, neither did the others. But slowly, the stories started to come out. Small truths about life in the neighbourhood, the invisible lines people crossed without knowing. David listened, really listened. He didn't have answers for everything, but he asked questions. And sometimes, that was enough. Months later, the neighbourhood began to change. Not in big ways. There were no headlines, no grand gestures, but small steps, conversations that hadn't happened before. Trust rebuilt one fragile thread at a time. Malik walked past Mrs. Henderson's apartment one day and saw her on the balcony. She waved. He waved back, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Across town, Chief Henderson sat in his office, his mother's words still echoing in his mind. Kindness deserves better than suspicion. He looked at the list of names for the next advisory meeting. Malik's at the top. Sometimes change began with a simple act, and sometimes the hardest walls to break down were the ones we built within ourselves. The head of campus security bristled. "You're asking us to admit we made a mistake." "I'm asking you to do the right thing." Dr. Hayes replied, meeting his gaze. Jordan Carter's future is at stake. How many more students will we fail before we take action? The dean hesitated, then nodded slowly. Let's start with reviewing Jordan's case. If we find sufficient evidence of mishandling, we'll take steps toward your recommendations. It wasn't the definitive victory, Doctor. Hayes wanted, but it was a step in the right direction. As the review unfolded, the tide began to turn. A key breakthrough came when a student came forward, admitting they had seen someone else near the student union at the time of the theft, someone who didn't match Jordan's description. With this new testimony, combined with the discrepancies in the security footage and Jordan's library alibi, it became clear that Jordan had been wrongly accused. A week later, the university issued a formal statement clearing Jordan of any wrongdoing. The dean personally apologized to him, acknowledging the flaws in the investigation and pledging to implement changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the apology, while welcome, didn't erase the damage. Jordan's reputation had been tarnished and the experience had left scars that wouldn't heal easily. Dr. Hayes wasn't finished. She knew that clearing Jordan's name was only the first step. At the next faculty meeting, she stood before her colleagues and delivered a powerful speech about the need for systemic change. This university prides itself on fostering diversity and inclusion, she said. But those words are meaningless if our actions don't reflect them. What happened to Jordan Carter isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem. We have a responsibility to do better. Her words resonated with many in the room, and over the following months, the university began implementing reforms. Bias training for staff became mandatory. A committee was formed to review campus security policies. And, perhaps most importantly, students like Jordan were given a platform to share their experiences and advocate for change. Jordan's life slowly returned to normal, though he knew he would never forget what he had endured. Dr. Hayes remained a steadfast ally, encouraging him to channel his frustration into action. "You have a voice, Jordan," she told him one day. "Use it." Inspired by her words, Jordan joined a student advocacy group, working to amplify the voices of others who had faced discrimination. His determination and resilience earned him respect across campus, transforming him from a target of suspicion into a symbol of strength. On a sunny spring afternoon, Jordan and Dr. Hayes stood together at a university event celebrating the launch of a new diversity and equity initiative. The program, which included scholarships for underrepresented students and workshops on cultural awareness, was a direct result of their efforts. "You made this happen, Doctor," Hayes said, her voice filled with pride. Jordan shook his head. "We made this happen." As the crowd applauded, Jordan looked out at the faces before him. He saw hope, progress, and the possibility of a better future, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. And for the first time since that day in the library, he felt like he truly belonged. The next day, Jordan sat in his intro to sociology class, trying to focus on the lecture. But his mind kept replaying the interrogation, the way the officers had looked at him as though his innocence was a question mark. When the class ended, he lingered behind, unsure if he should speak to the professor. Dr. Eleanor Hayes was known for her sharp intellect and fair approach to teaching. In her mid-40s, with silver streaks in her auburn hair, she commanded respect in the classroom. Jordan had always admired her, but he wasn't sure if she'd believe him. As the last student left, Dr. Hayes looked up and noticed Jordan standing by her desk. "Jordan, everything okay?" He hesitated, then said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," she said, gesturing to a chair. Jordan sat down, his hands clasped tightly. "Something happened yesterday," he began, explaining the accusation, the questioning, the way it had upended his life in just a few hours. He didn't expect her to fix it. He wasn't even sure why he was telling her, but he needed someone to hear him. Dr. Hayes listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "And you're certain you were in the library all afternoon?" "Yes," Jordan said, his voice firm. I have nothing to hide. She nodded slowly. Jordan, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't the first time something like this has happened on campus, and it's no secret that systemic biases can play a role in how situations like this are handled. Jordan's heart sank. He'd hoped for reassurance, for a promise that the truth would prevail. Instead, he felt the weight of her words, an acknowledgement of how stacked the odds were against him. But, she continued, her voice steady, I believe you, and I'm going to help you. Jordan blinked, caught off guard. You will? Absolutely, she said. This university has a responsibility to its students, and that includes ensuring they're treated fairly. I'll start by talking to campus security and seeing what evidence they have. We'll figure this out. For the first time since the accusation, Jordan felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It means a lot. Dr. Hayes smiled, her expression warm but determined. You focus on your studies, Jordan. Let me handle the rest. Over the next few days, Dr. Hayes threw herself into the task of uncovering the truth. She reviewed the security footage, noting that the figure's face was obscured and their clothing generic, a hoodie and jeans. It could have been anyone. She also spoke with the library staff, confirming that Jordan had been logged into the library's system during the time of the theft. But as she dug deeper, she encountered resistance. Campus security was reluctant to admit fault, and some administrators dismissed her concerns, insisting that the process was being handled appropriately. Dr. Hayes refused to back down. She knew this wasn't just about Jordan. It was about addressing the biases that allowed such accusations to happen in the first place. But as she fought for him, she couldn't ignore the doubt that crept into her own mind. What if she was wrong? What if Jordan wasn't as innocent as he claimed? One afternoon, she called Jordan to her office. I need you to be completely honest with me, she said, her tone serious. Is there anything at all you're not telling me? Jordan met her gaze, his eyes steady. No, Dr. Hayes. I didn't do this. Her doubts melted away. There was no hesitation in his voice, no shadow of guilt. She nodded, resolved. Then let's prove it. That evening, Dr. Hayes attended a faculty meeting where the case was briefly discussed. Some professors expressed concern about the impact on the university's reputation, while others were quick to side with campus security. It's not about reputation, Dr. Hayes said firmly. It's about justice. If we can't even protect our students from unfair treatment, what does that say about us as educators? Her words were met with silence, but she saw a few colleagues nod in agreement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Hayes caught the dean's attention. Dean Harper, she said, her voice calm but insistent. I'd like to request a formal review of the evidence in Jordan Carter's case. The dean sighed, clearly reluctant. Eleanor, we have protocols for a reason. Let the process play out. The process isn't infallible, she replied, and if it fails Jordan, it fails all of us. The dean hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. Dr. Hayes left the meeting feeling a mix of frustration and determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until Jordan's name was cleared. The moving truck rumbled down the narrow tree-lined road leading into Fairfield, a quiet town nestled in the heart of the Midwest. Marcus Hayes followed closely in his old sedan, its trunk packed with the essentials of his life, books, tools, and a few framed photographs of his family. The sight of Fairfield's modest main street, with its red brick buildings and American flags fluttering in the breeze, gave Marcus a cautious sense of hope. This town, with its sprawling fields and close-knit community, was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of living in the city, Marcus had decided to take a job at a local woodworking shop, hoping the slower pace of life would give him the clarity and peace he had been searching for. But as he parked in front of his new rental house, the glances from neighbours were anything but welcoming. Across the street, a woman watering her garden paused, her expression guarded. A man in a pickup truck slowed as he drove past, his gaze lingering a little too long. Marcus sighed, the weight of unspoken judgment settling on his shoulders. He had experienced this before. The hesitation, the sideways glances, the quiet whispers. He knew it wasn't just because he was new to town. It was because he was different. Fairfield was a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. People valued tradition, routine, and familiarity. Marcus quickly realized that newcomers, especially someone who didn't fit the town's predominantly white demographic, were viewed with suspicion. At the local diner, conversation stopped when he walked in. At the hardware store, the clerk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus kept his head down, focusing on his work at the woodworking shop. He was skilled with his hands, crafting intricate furniture and restoring antiques. His boss, Tom, was polite but distant, treating Marcus more as an employee than a peer. The other workers were friendly enough but rarely included Marcus in their conversations about local events or weekend plans. One evening, as Marcus worked late sanding a table, Tom approached him. "You're doing good work," Tom said, his tone neutral. "But don't take it personally if folks around here keep their distance. We've had some trouble in the past. People aren't always quick to trust." Marcus nodded, though the comment stung. He knew trouble was a veiled reference to the town's wariness of outsiders, especially those who didn't look like them. But he was determined to prove himself, not through words, but through actions. A few weeks later, Marcus ventured to the local farmers' market, hoping to blend into the community. He browsed the stalls, admiring the fresh produce and handmade crafts. As he reached for a jar of honey, he overheard two women whispering nearby. "That's the new guy," one said, her tone low but audible. "Moved here from the city." "Heard he's one of those migrants," the other replied, her voice tinged with unease. "You know how they are." Marcus pretended not to hear, though his grip tightened on the jar. He paid for it and walked away, his chest heavy with frustration. He wanted to scream, to confront them, but he knew it wouldn't change their minds. Instead, he went home, vowing to keep his focus on his work. But doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake moving here? Could he ever truly belong in a place like Fairfield? One bright Saturday morning, Marcus decided to take a walk along the river that wound through the edge of town. It was peaceful, the water sparkling under the sunlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He found a quiet spot to sit and reflect, letting the sounds of nature soothe his troubled thoughts. That's when he heard it, a faint cry for help. Marcus sprang to his feet, scanning the river. About 50 yards downstream, he saw a little girl clinging to a rock, the current tugging at her small frame. Panic surged through him as he realized the danger she was in. Without hesitation, he kicked off his shoes and dove into the water. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at his legs as he swam toward the girl. "Hold on," he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. When he reached her, he wrapped an arm around her waist, gripping the rock with his free hand. "I've got you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're going to be okay." The girl sobbed, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Slowly, carefully, Marcus pushed off the rock and swam toward the riverbank. His muscles burned, but he focused on each stroke, determined to get her to safety. When they reached the shore, Marcus collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The girl clung to him, her tiny body trembling. A woman came running toward them, her face pale with fear. "Emily!" she cried, scooping the girl into her arms. "Oh my God, are you okay?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He saved me, Mama. He saved me." The woman turned to Marcus, her expression a mix of gratitude and shock. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Marcus waved off her thanks, still catching his breath. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time." As the woman led her daughter back toward town, Marcus sat on the riverbank, dripping wet and exhausted. He didn't realize it then, but his life in Fairfield was about to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. When Marcus woke the next morning, he expected life to carry on as usual. He had done what anyone should do, helped someone in need. But Fairfield had a way of holding on to stories, and this one spread faster than Marcus could have imagined. By the time he stepped out of his house, neighbours who had once ignored him now waved, their smiles tentative but genuine. Marcus wasn't sure how to feel. The attention was unexpected, almost overwhelming. At the diner, the usual murmurs and stares were replaced with hushed conversations about the new guy who had saved Emily Bennett. The owner, a burly man named Joe, even insisted on covering Marcus's breakfast. "It's on the house," Joe said gruffly, setting down a plate of pancakes. "You did good out there." "Thank you," Marcus replied, though the sudden kindness felt surreal. He ate quickly, eager to slip back into his routine. That afternoon, as Marcus worked on a table at the woodworking shop, a shadow fell across his workspace. Looking up, he saw Sarah Bennett, Emily's mother, holding a neatly wrapped plate of cookies. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Sarah began, her voice steady but warm. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did. You didn't just save my daughter. You gave me back my entire world." Marcus set down his tools, his chest tightening at her words. "I'm just glad I was there," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." Sarah shook her head. "Not everyone would have jumped into that river. You did. And I'll never forget it." She handed him the cookies, and for a moment they stood in silence. Then, as if sensing his discomfort, Sarah added, "Emily wants to draw you a picture. It's her way of saying thanks. Maybe you could stop by for dinner sometime." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't used to such open invitations, especially in a town where he had been met with so much skepticism. But Sarah's sincerity was undeniable. "I'd like that," he said finally, a small smile breaking through. Word of Marcus's heroism continued to ripple through Fairfield. At the hardware store, the clerk greeted him by name and offered him a discount. At the farmer's market, people who had once avoided his gaze now approached him with friendly nods and even struck up conversations. Even Tom, his usually stoic boss, seemed to warm up. One morning, Tom gathered the shop's workers before the day began. "We've got a real hero among us," he said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder, "and one hell of a craftsman too." The recognition was strange at first, but Marcus couldn't deny the warmth it brought. Slowly, people began to approach him, not as an outsider, but as someone they wanted to know. They asked about his work, his life, his thoughts on the town. For the first time since moving to Fairfield, Marcus felt like he wasn't just existing on the edges, he was part of the fabric. A few weeks after the incident, Marcus attended a town hall meeting to discuss a new park project. The room was packed, and to his surprise, several people greeted him warmly. He had intended to sit quietly in the back, but Sarah Bennett spotted him and waved him over to a seat near the front. As the meeting progressed, residents discussed possible names for the park. Someone suggested naming it after a long-time resident, while others debated themes tied to Fairfield's history. Then Sarah stood, her voice clear and confident. "I think we should name it after Marcus Hayes," she said. "He showed us what it means to care for each other, no matter where we come from." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, who felt a flush of heat rise to his face. He shook his head, humbled and slightly embarrassed. "That's not necessary," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I just did what anyone would do." But Sarah smiled. "Not everyone would have done what you did." The suggestion sparked a wave of agreement. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. The new park would be named Hayes Riverside Park. The park dedication ceremony took place on a crisp autumn afternoon. The entire town turned out, filling the grassy expanse with laughter and conversation. As Marcus stood near the ribbon-cutting area, he marvelled at the transformation, not just of the park, but of the town itself. Emily ran up to him, holding a crayon drawing in her small hands. "This is for you," she exclaimed, beaming. Marcus knelt to take the drawing, his heart swelling. It depicted him pulling her from the river with the words, "My hero," scrawled at the top. He smiled, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Emily. This means a lot." Nearby, Sarah watched the exchange, her eyes glistening. "You've made a bigger impact here than you realise," she said quietly. As the mayor gave a speech about the importance of community and resilience, Marcus's thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. He had come to Fairfield hoping for a fresh start, unsure if he could ever truly belong. Now, he stood surrounded by people who had once been strangers, feeling the weight of their respect and gratitude. Over the following months, Marcus became a cornerstone of Fairfield. He continued his work at the woodworking shop, teaching younger workers the art of crafting furniture and volunteering to build benches and tables for the town square. His kindness and dedication inspired others to see the value in embracing newcomers and letting go of old prejudices. Jack, a gruff farmer who had once avoided Marcus at the diner, stopped by the shop one day with a basket of apples. "Thought you might like these," Jack said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "Heard you've been helping out with the park benches. That's good work." Marcus accepted the apples with a warm smile. "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it." The exchange was brief, but it symbolised something deeper, a shift in the town's attitude, one small step at a time. One snowy evening, as Marcus sat in his small house sipping tea, he reflected on how far things had come. The framed drawing Emily had given him hung on the wall, a reminder of the day everything changed. It wasn't just the town that had grown, it was him too. He had learned that belonging wasn't about fitting in, it was about showing up, being true to yourself, and letting your actions speak louder than words. Years later, Hayes Riverside Park became a gathering place for the entire town, a symbol of unity and resilience. Marcus often walked its trails, greeting joggers, families, and old friends along the way. The park wasn't just named after him, it was a testament to the power of courage and kindness to bridge even the deepest divides. As he watched children play by the riverbank one sunny afternoon, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. He had come to Fairfield as a stranger, but through one selfless act and a willingness to stay open, he had found something far greater than acceptance. He had found a home. Darius Carter wiped his brow with the back of his hand, the late afternoon sun beating down on the asphalt outside the car wash. It was another day of scrubbing, waxing, and buffing. Though the work wasn't glamorous, Darius took pride in doing it right. His customers deserved their cars spotless, no matter how menial the job seemed. That satisfaction kept him going, even when his manager, Mr. Beasley, found new ways to make the days harder. For Darius, the job wasn't just about earning a paycheck, it was a lifeline. After his mum's surgery a year ago, the family's medical bills had piled up, threatening to crush them. His little sister, Kayla, only 15, was relying on him to keep things together. She had dreams of college and becoming a graphic designer, and Darius had vowed to give her that chance. "Carter!" Beasley's sharp voice cut through the air. Darius sighed, setting down the rag he had been using to polish a car hood. Beasley's broad frame loomed in the office doorway, arms crossed, and an annoyed scowl plastered across his face. "Yes, sir?" "Step into the office," Beasley said curtly. Darius frowned but complied. He wiped his hands on his uniform pants and followed Beasley into the small, cramped office filled with faded motivational posters and old invoices. Beasley sat behind his cluttered desk, tapping a pen against a clipboard. "You're done here," Beasley said, looking up with a smirk. "Pack up your things." The words hit Darius like a slap. "What? Why?" His voice cracked, betraying the panic swelling in his chest. "I've been on time every day. I work harder than anyone else." "Customer complaint," Beasley said, cutting him off. He tossed the clipboard aside. "Said you were rude. Can't risk bad reviews." "That's not true," Darius said, clenching his fists. "I go out of my way to treat customers with respect." Beasley shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I don't need troublemakers on my team." Darius opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. He'd seen this coming. Beasley had been nitpicking his work for months, always finding small excuses to berate him. Now, he had an excuse to fire him outright. Darius swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let his frustration show. It wouldn't change anything. "Fine," he said quietly. He stripped off his uniform shirt, folding it neatly before placing it on the desk. Standing there in his undershirt, he felt exposed, humiliated. Beasley didn't even look at him as he walked out. Darius wandered aimlessly through the city, his thoughts swirling. Lincoln Park was quiet that afternoon, the sound of children laughing at the playground echoing through the air. Darius sat on a weathered bench, staring at his hands. They were still speckled with grease, a reminder of the day's work, and now the job he no longer had. "Excuse me, sir?" A polite voice broke through his thoughts. Darius looked up to see an older man in a tailored navy suit standing a few feet away. He was holding a set of car keys, his expression sheepish. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car won't start. I noticed you sitting here and thought maybe you could help." Darius hesitated, caught off guard. The man's suit and watch screamed money. Surely he could afford roadside assistance, but the man's tone was sincere, almost desperate. Sure," Darius said, standing. "I can take a look." The man led him to a sleek black Mercedes parked near the edge of the lot. "Name's Roger Hensley," he said, extending a hand. "Darius," he replied, shaking it before popping the hood. It didn't take long to diagnose the problem. A loose battery cable had interrupted the connection. Darius tightened it with practiced ease, checking everything twice before closing the hood. When Roger turned the key, the engine roared to life. "You're a lifesaver," Roger said, visibly relieved. "I was already late for an important meeting. Let me pay you for your trouble." Darius shook his head. "No need." Glad I could help, Roger hesitated, studying Darius for a moment. "You're good at this. Do you work with cars?" "Used to," Darius said, the bitterness creeping into his voice. "I lost my job this morning." Roger frowned. "From where?" "A car wash," Darius admitted. "It wasn't much, but it paid the bills." Roger tapped his chin, thinking. "You know, I've been looking for someone to help with a new project I'm launching. Someone who knows cars and has a strong work ethic. You interested?" Darius blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "You serious?" "Completely," Roger said, pulling a business card from his pocket. "Come by my office tomorrow, let's talk." The next morning, Darius stepped into the sleek lobby of Hensley Enterprises, the business card still clutched in his hand. The modern decor, polished floors, minimalist furniture, and an air of quiet efficiency made him feel out of place. He adjusted his tie nervously, glancing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the bustling city skyline. Everything about this place screamed success, and Darius couldn't shake the nagging doubt that he didn't belong. "Mr. Carter?" A young receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Hensley is expecting you. Please, follow me." Darius nodded, his palms damp, as he followed her through a set of glass doors into a conference room. Roger was waiting, seated at the head of a long table. His suit was impeccable, as if he had stepped straight out of a business magazine. When he saw Darius, he stood and extended a hand. "Good to see you, Darius," Roger said with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," Darius replied, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Roger gestured for him to sit. "Let's get straight to it. I'm launching a chain of luxury car detailing centres. High-end clients, premium service. I need someone to oversee operations, a leader who can ensure every car that leaves our shop is perfect. You'd start as an assistant manager, but if you prove yourself, there's plenty of room to grow." Darius hesitated, the enormity of the opportunity sinking in. "Why me?" he asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at him since yesterday. "You don't really know me." Roger smiled. "I know enough. You helped me when you didn't have to, and you didn't ask for anything in return. That tells me you have integrity, and from the way you handled my car, I can see you know your stuff. That's all I need to know." Darius felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't too good to be true. Maybe he deserved this chance. "I'm in," he said firmly. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. Roger wasn't kidding when he said the job would be demanding. Darius dove headfirst into learning everything he could about managing a high-end operation: inventory management, customer relations, marketing strategies, and employee training. Every night, he pored over manuals and spreadsheets, determined to master every aspect of the business. The hours were long, but Darius thrived under the pressure. For the first time, he felt like his hard work was truly valued. Roger didn't treat him like an underling. He treated him like a partner. He asked for Darius's opinions, encouraged his ideas, and trusted him to take the lead on important decisions. One of Darius's first major challenges came in the form of a disgruntled client. The man, a real estate developer with a temper as flashy as his sports car, stormed into the shop one afternoon, demanding to know why his vehicle wasn't ready. "I'm paying top dollar for this service," the man fumed, "and I expect it to be done on time." Darius stepped in, his tone calm but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir. Let me personally ensure your car is finished within the next 30 minutes, and we'll waive the detailing fee as an apology for the delay." The man blinked, caught off guard by Darius's professionalism. "Well, all right," he muttered, the fire in his voice extinguished. When the client left with his car gleaming, he shook Darius's hand. "You run a tight ship here," he said grudgingly. "I'll be back." Roger watched the interaction from the corner of the room, nodding approvingly. "You've got a gift, Darius," he said later. "Not everyone can turn a bad situation into a win like that." As the weeks turned into months, word began to spread about the new luxury detailing centre. A celebrity client posted a glowing review on social media, praising the attention to detail and exceptional service. The post went viral, bringing a flood of new customers through the doors. Under Darius's leadership, the business flourished. But it wasn't just about the numbers for Darius. He wanted to create a workplace where people felt valued, something he had never experienced at Beasley's car wash. He implemented training programs for the staff, teaching them not just the technical skills they needed, but also how to treat clients with respect and care. Darius also made a point of hiring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. He saw himself in them, eager to prove themselves but often overlooked because of where they came from. Through mentorship, he helped them develop confidence and a sense of purpose. One afternoon, Darius was surprised to see a familiar face walk through the shop doors. It was Mr. Beasley. Beasley's eyes widened as he took in the pristine showroom, the luxury cars gleaming under the lights, and the polished staff moving with precision. "Carter," he said, incredulous, "you work here?" "I manage this location," Darius replied evenly. "Can I help you?" Beasley shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat. I heard this place was doing well. Thought I'd check it out."